Lies We Tell Ourselves, written by Robin Talley and published in 2014, is a book about an African-American girl named Sarah Dunbar and her experience with integrating into the previously all-white Jefferson High School in the fictional town of Davisburg, Virginia. The story also stars a white girl named Linda Hairston, who on the flip side is a vehement opponent of integration and believes that blacks and whites should remain segregated. The two are ultimately forced to interact with each other for a school project, however, and as a result, Linda learns to understand Sarah's perspective as an African American and comes to change her views as the story unfolds. So I walked into this book expecting to get a better sense of what it might have been like for the first black integrators in America to integrate into white institutions, as well as I was curious if this would offer a sort of explanation and representation of how some people came to the conclusion that blacks were inferior to whites and should be separated from them. The book definitely fulfilled on the first inquiry, as one of the major themes that the book went into was the different levels of racism that blacks experienced and what that likely felt like to deal with. It showed all the different forms that racism could take, like verbal and physical harassment, verbal examples such as being called slurs or other offensive names, and physical examples from the book ranged from things like having objects thrown at you or being sexually assaulted, as well as social and institutional discrimination, like not being able to join clubs and extracurricular activities or not being able to leave school to tend to a sick sibling, and went into detail about what it felt like for the victims to be subjected to those forms of racism. Now, while this is a fictional story, I still found the portrayal of racism in the book and what that was like to deal with very believable and kind of eye-opening. Not to say that I had no idea that African Americans faced this kind of treatment in the past, but I don't think I've ever really had a good level of awareness about what that must have felt like to deal with. And I think this book definitely helped give me a better understanding of what it was like to go through what they did. I'd kind of compare the way Lies We Tell Ourselves illustrates racism against black integrators to the way the movie Schindler's List portrays life for Jews during World War II. Both get right down to the grit and rawness of the atrocities being committed against the people and try to paint a picture of people experiencing these things authentically. I think both try to show you firsthand what it would have been like to be in those circumstances and try to make it feel like you're actually experiencing what those people went through way back when. Though Schindler's List definitely seems to make that aspect of its story much more developed and focused on than Lies We Tell Ourselves. But I appreciate that a lot because I feel like that's a perspective that I don't usually get from just reading about the history of some major injustice like segregation or the Holocaust. At least for me, I usually have a hard time fully comprehending just how terrible things like segregation and the Holocaust were, and just reading about them isn't enough to help me realize how bad they were. And so that's why I'm very appreciative of stories like Lies We Tell Ourselves and Schindler's List, because they allow me to better understand more of what it was like for the people who had to endure some form of oppression or abuse. And so the next time I see a similar situation come up in the media, or I witness a similar event personally, I can better understand the gravity of what's going on and have a better idea of what the people in those situations might be experiencing. As to my second inquiry in regard to the theme of how people become and continue to be racists, the book did not really deliver in that regard. It didn't really do that great of a job of helping me understand the thought process of a racist and why they treated African Americans the way that they did in real life, or even in the book for that matter. From what I recall, the only kind of insight that the book would offer came from occasional inner monologues that Linda would have, where she would be deliberating over her ideas on black people after Sarah had brought up an argument opposing her racist beliefs. But while those were better than nothing, that was about as much as that issue was addressed. The book did go into some detail about how Linda's beliefs stemmed from her father, who it seemed she wanted to impress, and that was how she came to have a racist ideology. But for the rest of the racists in the book, all I really knew was that they didn't see African Americans equal to white Americans and believed that they should be separated from whites. So the fact that the book didn't really engage with that theme too much was mildly disappointing. One thing that I definitely did not expect I would be walking into when I read Lies We Tell Ourselves, and while this is spoiler territory, if you look at other books Robin Talley has written, I feel like you'd figure this out anyways, so I'm just going to go ahead and talk about it. I did not expect a lesbian romance to be a major part and theme of the novel, so that was an interesting surprise. It turns out that both Sarah and Linda have an attraction to girls, and more specifically to one another as well. Sarah had been suppressing her homosexual desires as a result of her being raised on the idea that it is immoral and sinly and what have you. Meanwhile, Linda had retained the notion that homosexual relationships could only end badly, which is an idea that came from a book she got about the consequences of homosexual relationships. I'm assuming there's more to why she's against homosexual relationships than the fact that she's read a book about how bad they are, but that's technically all the book lets on about. As the story develops, however, Sarah grows to doubt whether being attracted to girls is wrong, and what exactly makes it wrong when it feels so right. By the end of the book, she's of the mindset that God wouldn't make something wrong feel so good if he wasn't okay with her doing it. And just as well, she ends up convincing Linda that things aren't as black and white as her book portrays it, and that she should come to her own conclusions about it. While I certainly hadn't anticipated that the book would incorporate elements of a teen romance novel, I thought that the parallels that it showed between how people supporting something good can also be just as ignorant and wrong as the people and ideas they fight against when it comes to a different issue were well put. So I think that idea was a nice little extra bit of introspection as opposed to just making a book focused on what it was like for the first integrators to experience racism. In terms of my actual overall enjoyment of the book, I really enjoyed it. I do feel slightly awkward admitting that though, because I will 100% acknowledge that Lies We Tell Ourselves definitely has a teen romance novel kind of feel and level of quality to it. This is particularly noticeable whenever the book is describing the relationship between Sarah and Linda. The book essentially chalks it up to them each thinking that there's something special and unique about the other person for no real reason aside from the fact that they both think the other person is pretty, talented, and opinionated. The way the book words it when one person is describing their feelings for the other, it often makes it sound as if there's this mystical force pulling them to the other person, and that aspect of the book definitely made me feel silly reading it. But I'm also not a love expert, so maybe that's an accurate representation of teen romances. But despite that, I still found Lies We Tell Ourselves to be very entertaining and enjoyable for the most part. The only part of the book that I remember being a low point was an event that occurred between Sarah and Linda that results in them not interacting with each other for a large portion of the rest of the book. And for me, a lot of interesting and entertaining parts of the book came from conversations and arguments between Sarah and Linda, so their split made the book not as interesting to read for a while until they eventually started interacting with each other again. But that was really the only major issue that I can remember having with the book. Otherwise, I always looked forward to reading it when I had the chance. It's possible that because I didn't expect Lies We Tell Ourselves to turn into a teen romance novel halfway through, that when it finally did get to that point, I was already invested enough in the book to the point that the book's shifting genres didn't really make that much of a difference to my overall enjoyment of the book. But I could see how those who see this review who don't think they are interested in teen romance novels might get turned off of Lies We Tell Ourselves as a result. But I would really recommend giving it a try and see how it goes for the first few chapters, just to see if it really is the case that it's not for you, because I found it to be very worth my while.